Humans not the strongest, not the fastest, but the most dangerous Dralvek. The Kelthari scientist stared at the data screen in front of him. It was nothing new. He had studied hundreds of species across the galaxy. Some species lived in swarms, some in packs, others alone. Each had its own survival mechanism. The insectoid Zathar, for example, could withstand extreme temperatures, their exoskeletons protecting them from even the hottest environments the nomads of Serion had perfected, evasion able, to disappear into any environment with the skill of a shadow. But humans, they were different. They had none of the strengths of other species, physically. They were unremarkable. Their endurance was average, their agility subpar, their size nothing to fear, yet every civilization they countered feared them. The Galactic Council had long dismissed human warfare records as exaggerations, perhaps to justify their lack of respect for human military power. Dralvek had his own theory. Humans, with their primitive technology and lack of true biological superiority, must have relied on advanced tools. It wasn't their bodies that made them a threat, but their machines. They were clever, that much was clear. They used weapons strategies and numbers. They were just another warlike species. He intended to prove it. A controlled experiment was the only way to settle the issue. Dralvek had gathered humans of various backgrounds: soldiers, civilians, criminals. They would be subjected to escalating stress, threats, and pain. His hypothesis, once the humans realized they weren't in control of the situation, they would either surrender, flee, or simply fail. All species did, but this wasn't just any experiment. This was going to push them to their limits. He set up the experiment on a research facility far from any other sentient life. A perfect place to test the theory. The humans were herded into a large cold chamber. Dralvek observed them through a one-way observation window, taking notes on their reactions. The room filled with a soft hum as it began to adjust to their presence. At first they reacted predictably. The soldiers tried to assess the room, their eyes scanning for threats. The civilians huddled together. The criminals, predictably, sized up the guards Dralvek had arranged for a sequence of escalating scenarios. First, he sent in a series of simulated explosions, shaking the room, creating fear. The humans flinched. They jumped. The soldiers issued orders trying to organize the civilians. Some criminals panicked, looking for any escape route. No surprises so far. Then the temperature dropped. Frost began to coat the windows. Human bodies reacted, huddling together for warmth. The soldiers gave instructions for the civilians to keep moving their eyes, shifting to the exit, analyzing escape options. The criminals started to fight amongst themselves. This was all normal. Every species acted similarly when pushed to the edge, but then something changed. Dralvek watched in fascination as a human soldier. The kind who looked like he had been through countless battles shifted. He no longer cared about the cold, about the civilians. His eyes hardened. His body language shifted. He was no longer reacting to the threat, was taking control of it. The others followed suit. The soldiers organized the group in a way that was unnatural. The civilians fell into line. They weren't running. They weren't afraid. There was no panic. There was just a sudden, terrifying calm. It was like flipping a switch. The temperature dropped further. Frost began to form on the floor, but the soldiers, those with the most experience, moved with a purpose. They set up barricades, checking their equipment. Dralvek's eyes widened. This wasn't fear or panic. It wasn't even survival. It was something else. And then the first test came. He activated a series of holographic enemies, simulated, of course, alien creatures of varying size, shape, and form, each designed to challenge the humans they attacked. In waves, first small skirmishes, then larger assaults. The soldiers reacted, grabbing weapons, positioning themselves, strategically shouting orders, and forming defensive positions. The civilians, many of whom had never fought before, fell into line, following orders, but it wasn't just their training. The soldiers began to move faster, as if they weren't thinking about the fight. They didn't care about survival anymore. They didn't think. They attacked with a single-mindedness that was more primal than anything Dralvek had seen. The civilians, too, began to shift. The men and women who had never held a weapon before began to act like soldiers, using whatever they could to fight to protect their own, and the criminals, they turned savage. The stress and fear had pushed them beyond themselves. They fought like animals. Dralvek sat frozen in place as he watched. His data wasn't enough to explain. These humans didn't just survive. They annihilated. They were a species that didn't care about their own lives once they crossed a threshold. They stopped thinking. They shifted into pure, unbridled aggression. Dralvek's heart raced. He knew deep down that he had discovered something terrifying as the simulated battle continued. The humans were no longer trying to survive. They were killing efficiently. The soldiers had shifted from defending to hunting. The civilians followed their lead. The criminals fought with a viciousness that could only come from being pushed to a point where survival wasn't the goal anymore. The room began to fill with the sound of simulated gunfire, the cries of alien creatures being eliminated one by one. Dralvek had to remind himself that it wasn't real. This wasn't a battlefield. This wasn't life or death. But the humans, they didn't care. The kill switch had been activated. The last of the holographic enemies fell, and the room fell silent. Dralvek sat back, staring at the data streams as they flooded in. His hand trembled slightly as he input the final numbers he had. Expected to see fear, desperation, even surrender. But he had seen something else entirely. The humans had turned into something more primal. They had transformed into predators. They had shifted their focus from survival to total domination. It wasn't technology that made humans dangerous. It wasn't their weapons. It was their biology. When pushed far enough, humans didn't care about survival. They only cared about killing, and Dralvek realized with a cold, sinking feeling that he had underestimated humanity. He would report his findings to the Galactic Council. Of course, but there was no denying it. Now humans were not just a threat, they were the most dangerous species in the galaxy. If they ever turned their aggression towards the galaxy as a whole, no one would survive, not the Khazar Dominion, not the Sarathi Collective, not anyone. The galaxy had only one chance to avoid war with humans, and that was to never provoke them. Dirk knew, however, that it was already too late. Dralvek's report to the Galactic Council did not go as he had hoped. The chamber was filled with the usual assortment of alien dignitaries, members of the Serti, the Jathar, the Khazar Dominion. Each of them sat in their high-backed chairs staring down at Dralvek with various expressions of disinterested skepticism or open disdain. They're just another violent species. One of the Khazar representatives sneered, "The kind of behavior you describe is not new. We've seen it before in many species across the galaxy. They're just more aggressive than others. It's nothing we haven't dealt with." Dralvek felt his jaw tighten. He had expected resistance, but not this level of dismissal. He knew that the Khazar as a warrior race wouldn't understand. They had their own way of dealing with violence, a kind of efficiency that mirrored human aggression, but without the same biological underpinning. But the others, the Seer, the Jathar, they were supposed to be thinkers. They were supposed to understand their aggression. Dralvek continued trying to maintain his composure. Isn't just a normal response to danger. It's physiological. Humans possess a mechanism in their biology, something that triggers when they are pushed far enough. When they hit a certain threshold of pain, fear, or stress, they cease to care about their own survival. They stop thinking about escaping or retreating. They become singularly focused on annihilating their enemies. The room fell silent. A few of the delegates exchanged glances, but none spoke. Dralvek felt the weight of their skepticism hanging in the air. "I've observed it myself." Dralvek pressed during simulations. "I've seen it in real combat situations as well. Humans don't just fight, they stop caring. They will sacrifice themselves, their comrades, everything just to eliminate the threat. It is a biological trait, a kill switch, if you will." The Khazar representative chuckled darkly. "And what you expect? Us to believe that humans can become more dangerous than us? They're just more bloodthirsty animals." Jathar took a deep breath. He had prepared for this, but it was no easier to face. He was about to tell them something they wouldn't like. He couldn't. afford to be subtle anymore. I've seen it firsthand, he said. I saw them in action, fighting against the Khazar Dominion. The room froze. The delegates leaned forward, their expressions shifting from boredom to something more serious. The Khazar Dominion had attacked a neutral station where a group of human mercenaries had been stationed. The station was small, not a strategic asset and not heavily defended. It was meant to be a place of observation, a neutral zone, a checkpoint in a remote system. But the Khazar had decided it was an ideal location to test their strength against the humans. The mercenaries, outnumbered and outgunned, were preparing for the worst. The station was a tin can, a floating target in the vast void of space, surrounded by nothing but asteroids. The Khazar came in waves, their ships bombarding the station from all sides. It was clear that the Khazar intended to eradicate the human presence quickly. Most species would have panicked. The humans did not. Dralvek had embedded himself with the mercenaries, hoping to see how they would react under pressure. He had been prepared for fear, for desperation. Instead, he watched as something shifted in the humans. They didn't panic, they didn't flee, they didn't even try to negotiate. They attacked the first wave of Khazar warriors, boarded the station with the typical arrogance of their kind. They were used to overwhelming their enemies with brute strength and numbers, but the humans weren't retreating. They weren't cowering in. Fear, they weren't even trying to escape. Instead, they went to work. Dralvek watched as the mercenaries set traps, created ambushes, and used every scrap of their environment to fight back the wounded soldiers. Their arms broken, their faces bloody, didn't hesitate. They continued to fight. They used their own injuries to bait the Khazar, feigning weakness to lure them into position where they could eliminate them. It was nothing like he had expected. The Khazar, who had been so sure of their victory, began to panic. Their warriors, seasoned and fierce, found themselves facing enemies who no longer feared death. The humans didn't care about their own survival. They only cared about taking down the enemy one by one. The Khazar warriors fell. Some were shot down by sniper fire, others were lured into traps, and the rest were overwhelmed by the sheer determination of the humans. The battle was hard. The Khazar had the numbers, but the humans had something else. They had no fear, no mercy. By the time the Khazar had realized they were losing, it was too late. The station was littered with their bodies, the survivors were few, and the humans didn't even acknowledge their pleas for mercy. Doktchik was in shock. He had seen many battles in his time. He had studied countless species, yet he had never seen anything like this. The humans weren't just warriors, they were predators, and they fought not for survival, but for victory. When it was over, the humans stood amongst the wreckage. They didn't celebrate. They didn't cheer. They didn't even speak. They simply began to collect the wounded and prepare for the next conflict. It was as if the fight had never mattered to them in the first place. Dralvek returned to the Galactic Council with the data, but now there was no denying it. He had seen the human kill switch in action. The Council could no longer dismiss his findings as an exaggeration. DC, one of the Seer delegates, spoke. Are you saying that humans have an inherent capacity to turn off their survival instincts? In battle, Dralvek nodded. Yes, when pushed far enough. When the right conditions are met, they stop caring about surviving. They focus only on destroying their enemies. No mercy, no retreat. The Seer delegate leaned back deep in thought. This could be a problem. The council was divided. The Khazar representative had lost much of his previous bravado. The Dralvek delegate was clearly concerned. Dralvek saw the fear in their eyes. Even if they didn't say it aloud, they realized the truth now. Humans were not just another warlike species. They were something else entirely. They were the apex predators. Dralvek had seen the fear spread across the Galactic Council like a wave. The Khazar representative was the first to speak, but his words were far from the confident sneer he had shown earlier. You expect us to believe that these humans are so dangerous that they'll stop caring about their survival and just hunt us down? His voice was tinged with unease, something Dralvek had never thought possible coming from a member of the Khazar Dominion. The Sarathi delegate, whose species was known for their philosophical mindset, sat in thoughtful silence. The Jathar, a race of highly intelligent beings who prided themselves on their tactical brilliance, seemed unusually quiet. Dralvek knew that the weight of his findings was sinking in, despite their denial. They don't need to be strong or fast. Dralvek pressed on, not giving them the chance to dismiss him again. What they have is a biological response that makes them worse than the most dangerous predators we've encountered. The kill switch is real when a human is pushed to the edge. They go beyond the normal fight or flight responses. They shift into a state where the goal is simply to eliminate the threat, no matter the cost. He paused, scanning the faces of the council members. None of them spoke. Dralvek could feel the tension in the room. The truth was undeniable, but none of them wanted to acknowledge the implications I observed. At first hand, he continued. When the Khazar Dominion attacked that station, they thought they were dealing with mercenaries. They expected resistance. What they didn't expect was the complete absence of fear in the humans. They fought with no care for their own lives only, the destruction of their enemies. The Khazar representative shifted in his seat. His limbs flexed nervously, betraying his frustration. We fought worse. If your humans are as dangerous as you claim, then why didn't we crush them? Why didn't we wipe them out? Dralvek smiled grimly because you didn't understand them. You treated them like any other species, but they're not the moment the fight began. The humans shifted their focus from survival to victory. They were no longer afraid. Of you? They were focused on annihilation. You couldn't stop them because you didn't know how to fight something that has no concept of self-preservation. A murmur rippled through the room. Dralvek could see the unease spread like wildfire. The humans were a problem, a big one. The council called for a vote, though. DRC already knew the outcome. He watched as each delegate spoke up, some in favor, others against, but none of them dared to speak the truth aloud. Finally, the vote was tallied. We propose placing restrictions on human expansion, the Seer delegate announced. For the safety of the galaxy, we must ensure that humanity's influence doesn't spread unchecked. Their potential for aggression, once triggered, is too great to ignore. Dralvek could hear the whispers of concern, the subtle acknowledgement that the humans had tipped the balance of power in ways no one could have predicted. They weren't just another species to be catalogued, their aggression a result of their environment or culture. The humans were something far more dangerous. The Jathar representative spoke next, but there was an edge of something Dralvek couldn't quite place. This isn't an extreme measure, but we must acknowledge the threat. We cannot allow humanity to expand further without control. They will destabilize the entire galaxy. If they are not contained, the Khazar, still nursing their pride, were silent now. Their military forces had been thoroughly humiliated, and the truth of humanity's capabilities had hit them harder than any weapon. Dralvek didn't speak, but he couldn't help but feel a growing unease. The humans weren't a threat to be contained. They weren't a problem to be solved. They were a ticking time bomb, a species born for war, their biology wired for conflict in ways the rest of the galaxy had never even begun to comprehend. And that was exactly why humanity would never be stopped. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit chamber far from the council's halls, a human diplomat sat at a simple desk. His expression was calm, even as his colleagues fussed around him preparing for their next negotiation. They had heard of the Galactic Council's vote of the decision to limit human expansion. The diplomat's lips curled into a faint, knowing smirk. They think they can contain us, he muttered under his breath. One of his aides glanced up. Sir, what are we going to do? The diplomat stood up slowly, straightening his uniform. What we always do. We don't start wars, we end them. His voice was low. He wasn't angry. He wasn't worried. He wasn't afraid. In fact, he seemed more at peace than anyone else in the room. It was as though he understood something the others didn't. We remind them, he continued, exactly who they're dealing with. The council had no idea what they had just set in motion. Their decision to limit humanity's growth might have been a precaution, a fear-driven response to something they didn't fully understand. But in doing so, they had just drawn a line in the sand. The humans didn't start wars, they ended them, and when the time came, they would remind the galaxy of that. Dralvek wasn't sure if he should feel a sense of relief or dread. He had seen firsthand the power humanity wielded. He had observed their ability to eliminate threats with a ruthless efficiency that no other species could match. But what concerned him the most was the sheer indifference with which they fought. They didn't need to win. They didn't even need to survive. They needed to end the conflict, and they would do it at any cost. As he left the council chamber, Dralvek felt a chill crawl down his spine. He had seen what humanity was capable of, and now the entire galaxy was about to learn the hard way.